and welcome to the Hardcore Soft Skills Podcast. This is Yadi Caro. In each episode, we delve into a different skill with the help of an expert. After each episode, you can start applying what you have learned to advance in your career and become a better leader. I believe soft skills make hard skills work. Today, we'll learn about empathy. When we talk about empathy and work, the relation may not be evident, but as studies have shown, empathy helps create a better workplace and helps us become better managers. My guest today is dedicated to show that empathy is essential for business success. Mimi Nicklin is the best-selling author of the book, Softening the Edge, the host of the Empathy for Breakfast online show, and the Secrets of the Gap podcast. She is an experienced marketer and communication strategist and an empathy advocate. She spoke with me from her home in Dubai, and we discussed the need for empathy at work and how we can start building up this skill. Let's listen. I need to ask you then, but why focus on the topic of empathy?
So for me, my journey to the Middle East, in fact, was to take over a business that needed substantial turnaround at the time. So it was a sort of a regeneration project, as it were. And when I came into that role, I came into a region entirely alone. I didn't know anybody here. I didn't have a network or contacts or anything here. And I was absolutely committed to that business turnaround story by putting people at the center of everything we do. So I talk a lot about balancing humanism and capitalism, and that's really what that was about. It was about how do we prove to the world that we can turn around a business and create profit, create actual difference to the bottom line by balancing or actually prioritizing people as well as, obviously the financial security that the business needed. So that was how I sort of started on this journey. When I was doing that, it was an incredibly difficult time in my life. I was a single mom of a small baby in a region where I didn't know anyone. And this was a very entrepreneurial role. And I had never been an entrepreneur. I grew up, as it were, in my career in very corporate advertising and sort of very, systemized the corporate side of advertising in terms of big clients, Procter & Gamble, GlaxoSmithKline, Coca-Cola, big systemized systems. I can't think of another word. Mm-hmm. This role was incredibly dynamic. This was a very entrepreneurial role. And that was a really big shift for me. And during that process, I saw a business coach to get some advice on some of the things that I was experiencing and seeing. And we were at lunch and we were talking about intuition. Well, I was talking about intuition and how I had intuition for this, that, and the other. And she said to me, Mimi, can I stop you there and just ask you, is it intuition or is it empathy that you're talking about? And I said, no, it's not empathy. I'd never thought about empathy in the business world. But what that led me to do was a series of studies and to start real research into what empathy is, what is it in the world, what is the empathy deficit, why do we have one, and to really question why this wasn't a conversation in the corporate world. Once I understood it, I guess my life changed really. I couldn't stop talking, writing about it because it suddenly seemed so obvious, that this is such a huge theme and such a valuable topic. And of course, the more data you read, the more you realize this is something that is impacting the bottom line. This is making us money. And yet people are sort of pushing it aside or not understanding it. So yeah, that was really the journey. And as I said, then I wrote a book, but I always say that I feel like the book wrote me because I can barely remember writing it. It was such a passionate outpouring of interest and empathy. So yeah, and now a year and a half on, the world is a little bit more aware.
Yeah, and I really enjoyed your book, particularly when you start narrating from your experience, the challenging times that you had at work. There was in this chapter that you talked about when you were leading an agency and you had to go through a particular tough economic times, and you use empathy towards a situation. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. That whole turnaround really had empathy at its core. So what the book does is really talk about all the different areas where I discovered and leveraged empathy in order to make a difference. So for sure, as I said, there was multiple parts. Some of it was more, I guess the core of that is a cultural change. So at the sort of backbone of all organizational empathy is listening, really, is creating a culture of listening where people feel heard, where leaders are hearing their teams and vice versa, where we see low self-censorship. Because when we have low empathy, when we have low emotional intelligence, you see high self-censorship, which means people are not sharing, strategizing, creativity, innovation. These are all things that go down when self-censorship is high. So if you want to get to a space, and particularly in a creative business like mine, where you have low self-censorship, you need high empathy. You need people to feel psychologically safe. You need a very emotionally intelligent organization, because at the end of the day, as human beings, we thrive when we're seen and when we're heard. I mean, that's really the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy, right? That sort of age-old model now. But what is it that we need as human beings? We need to be connected. We need to work together. We need to be recognized. So I guess the fundamental shift in that business was a cultural one. And that was a big one, because the team I took over was not prepared for that. You know, they had a very different style of leadership before that. So this was a journey. It was a journey to encourage people to feel comfortable, that they would be heard, that they had an opinion, and that this was an organization that wanted to grow with them and sort of not alongside them. But yeah, so that was, I guess, the fundamental shift. But as I said, there are many facets of that. We did work around sort of space and the environment we're in. We did work around benefits and structures. We did work around, you know, all of our HR policies, even things like the milk in the fridge. I always remember was quite a big turning point. So yeah, you know, it was a very sort of multifaceted change to the business, and it took us about 2 years.
And what do you mean by the milk in the fridge situation in terms of was it having enough for everybody, or how was that?
Actually, the milk in the fridge was, I always joke about this, two of the tiny things we changed was the milk and the coffee. The milk in the fridge until that date had always been what at least the British call UHT milk, long life milk. You know, the milk that you buy in the supermarket on the shelf, not in the fridge. Uh-huh. And there's nothing wrong with that milk. It's just they had never been given fresh milk. And when I did my first questionnaire to the team to ask them about their working environment and what would be rewarding and all of these things, a couple of people said, we'd really like fresh milk. So I was like, well, that's something I can fix. You know, of all the things that looked like massive challenges and stumbling blocks for me, replacing the milk was an easy one. And we soon upgraded the coffee machine as well. And those, you know, people for quite a long time talked about that.
Yeah.
That, you know, that they'd been heard. It was such a small thing, but we didn't sort of brush it off and say, well, no, that's the milk we have. We tried to make sure that all these small things they said, we responded to.
That's great. And before we continue talking about the overall empathy, I want to hear your definition of empathy and some of the misconceptions that you may have heard as you approach people to talk about empathy in the workplace.
Absolutely. So for me, at its core, empathy is about perspective taking. It's I often say empathy is your data set in an organizational context, because it is that data set that allows you to understand better, understand your teams, your colleagues, your people, your culture, but also your clients, your stakeholders, your partnerships. There are many forms of empathy. Empathy is a very multifaceted and actually quite misunderstood neurological skill set that we're born with. And there are different types of empathy, but for the sake of this conversation and for most of my work where I'm talking to the corporate world, I see it as perspective taking. It really is the ability to stand in the shoes of another, to understand the context from another's point of view, so that you can understand how did they get to that decision, why are they making that decision, why do they see this scenario or this stage of a negotiation as they do, really being able to take that perspective. In terms of misunderstandings or things that I've come across that people have perhaps thought of it differently, I would say the most common one, or the most common question, is the difference between sympathy and empathy. And, you know, you obviously are positioning lots of your work around soft skills and these emotional skills, but a huge part of my verbatim out there is that this is not a soft skill. That empathy is not soft. In fact, it's very hard to master and extremely hard to find. So it's, you know, and the reason I talk about that is because I think it's very easy for people to be like, oh, this soft stuff. No, this is a hard business marker. This is affecting profit, productivity, output, morale, loyalty, motivation, everything. This is not like a little soft thing you can kind of pat. This is a a hard leadership trait that
Yeah.
you can bring into your team and your culture.
You also talk in the book about the current deficit in empathy. Now, do you consider that after now with COVID and all the challenges we've been encountering, that has started to shift?
Look, I think it's double-edged. I think on the one hand, yes, certainly from my perspective, the conversation, as I mentioned earlier, the awareness of empathy in the corporate world particularly has increased, I mean, 100-fold. You know, I always say when I got my publishing agreement, which was not that long ago, November 2019, so 14 months ago or something. My gosh, my life changed quickly since then. But you know, when that happened, and I spoke to my mum, and I called her, and I said, "Mum, someone's going to publish my book," and she said, "Well, darling, that's wonderful, but who wants to read a book about empathy?" And you know, I was like, "Thanks, Mum," but you know, she's absolutely right. At the time, no one was talking about empathy. It was, you know, and she was accurate. She couldn't get her head around why there would be a whole book all about empathy. Now, in those 14 months, I mean, now my journey has just been a monumental climb into this new world, because the media, you know, you see people hiring chief empathy officers over in America now. This is a term that is becoming very sort of mainstream, and it's popping up everywhere. So, you know, there has been a really fundamental shift into that awareness and that sort of acknowledgement of what it is. So from a COVID point of view, that's helped. COVID has helped elevate this understanding of what we want from our lives and our work, the working environments we require. You know, we could never have imagined this en masse home work environment working. So there's been a mass reappraisal. At the same time, empathy has two great enemies, as it were. One of them is low time, and the other is high stress. And stress being a huge part of that, the state of mental health in our world right now, and you know, we're heading into ever higher numbers as we go into 2021, does mean that it makes it more difficult to empathize. So just the way the brain works, when you have those high levels of cortisol and adrenaline, noradrenaline pumping around your body, the part of the brain that is activated for empathy isn't lit up, as it were. So yeah, so in summary, COVID-19 has had a real dual impact. On the one hand, there's a far higher awareness and openness to empathy as a skill set. But on the other hand, as stress continues to go up, this prolonged stress, we are seeing many people sort of retreat into this very ego, self-centric world, which of course doesn't help increase our empathy levels.
And since we're talking about that too, you provide some through your podcast as well as in the book, you provide some insights of how we can certainly improve empathy on our day to day. Could you share with us a couple of actions that we could take either as managers or either as part of a team to increase empathy at work?
Yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned earlier, I mean, listening is a really key part of that. So creating a culture that values feedback, discussion, mutual understanding is probably the biggest tip, as it were, the starting point. You have to have a team that is really open to that change. But within that, there are many things you can be doing as an individual or as teams in the workplace to enable us to connect more sort of in our mutual humanity, as it were. Body language has a huge part in that. Just how you address people, how you sit and face them, not crossing your arms, maintaining eye contact. Smiling. I often say that smiling is one of the most underrated sort of superpowers of the corporate world. All of these signals activate subconscious parts of our brain that allow us to feel safe, to increase trust and loyalty, to share more, to deliver sort of more insight in what we're talking about. So those things are really, really key. Creating space for people to be able to communicate. So in our world, we're so rushed, we're in such a hurry all the time. We very often finish people's sentences for them. We're very uncomfortable with silence, but creating space for people to be able to finish their thought, to actually say what they're thinking and not what you think they're thinking, is an incredibly important part. And then the language you use is also, we could talk about that for a while, but there's a lot of language we can use that really encourages people to feel seen and to share more. And that goes for really, tough corporate environments. such as the military, the FBI, are using this type of language to encourage more conversation. So really sort of saying to people, as I mentioned earlier, how did you get there? What is your context? Can you tell me why you're making that decision today? What was your path to getting here? Can you help me understand? These types of language, sort of these types of formulations of language, can be used across all types of boardrooms in order to create that sort of human connection and encourage more empathy, more emotional intelligence, really, in that workforce.
Thank you so much for that advice, because it's small actions that we take every day that can certainly make an impact and can bubble to the top in terms of how leaders approach their management style.
Absolutely.
And what's the best way if for people to contact you? I highly recommend our listeners to read the book and also listen to the podcast episodes that you released. And what's the best way to get in touch with you?
I'm probably most active on LinkedIn, which is my name, so Mimi Nicklin, and also over on Instagram at Mimi Nicklin, and on Twitter also at Mimi Nicklin. So I'm very active on social, and I do make sure I reply to every message. So definitely pop on over and find me there. And as you said, the book is available, everywhere really. So it's on Amazon. It's in all good leading bookstores as well. So yeah, I would love to hear from people and see what they think.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Hardcore Soft Skills Podcast. I have more resources for you from today's episode. Just go to the website hardcoresoftskillspodcast.com and subscribe to receive the weekly lessons. If you like what you've heard, give us a 5-star review via the website or via Apple Podcasts and share with others as well. Thank you, and until the next episode.